there are real big issues and problems in the UK right now, and whatever people think about right levels of immigration, or whether it's too high or too low or whatever, immigration is not the root cause of the issues that the UK is grappling with right now. Brexit is more of a root cause of them than immigration is. But if you're Keir Starmer and you're effectively saying, yeah, Nigel Farage is right, it's immigration, so I'm just going to try to be better at dealing with it than he is, I just think that is so misguided. He's legitimising Nigel Farage's central argument. And if you legitimise your opponent's central argument, then don't be surprised if people vote for your opponent.
A lot of politicians begin their speeches or their sentences or their conversations with the words, let's be honest, and then they actually aren't. This book is surprisingly candid. It's raw, it's unflinching. You discuss everything from the impact Margaret Thatcher had on you, your relationship with Alex Salmond, how it broke down, your electoral failures in govern before your successes, your miscarriage, and then the extraordinary success of the SNP, of you personally. You talk about the trans rights issues, gender definitions, and what you got right and wrong there. And I think you even described false rumours around a blowjob at one stage. I mean, reading between
right, I think
lines.
I've got to go now.
Right. And you end by talking about the police investigation that overshadowed so much of the last years. Nicola Sturgeon will come on to all of that, but it is definitely frank. And the place I want to start is, I think, one that will chime with a lot of women, which is that sense of image, of having to define your own image as a political neophyte. And you describe yourself as sort of mimicking those around you, mainly middle-aged men. And you say, as a result, I developed a very serious and austere persona, dark plain clothes, portrayed as dour, frumpy and unattractive. I came across as a personality-free zone. It's kind of it's weird to recognise that that's what was happening to you.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't conscious at the time. It's only looking back on it that I recognise that. And I think it will be the experience of lots of women in lots of walks of life, but public-facing roles probably in particular. And if you're surrounded by men as a young woman, there's a confidence issue, regardless of how naturally confident or otherwise you are. And I wasn't a particularly confident young person. And I think you try to, or at least I tried to overcome that by, what I say in the book, fitting in with my surroundings, mimicking, the dress style, the behaviour, the mannerisms, the way of speaking of the men I was surrounded by. And you it took me a long time. I was probably into my 30s before I really properly understood that. That didn't get me any plaudits by the men around me. Instead, I was described in the way that you've just read out in the book. But then the thing you then realise is, if you decide to go the other way and be really feminine and individualist, that's when you are described as not serious, frivolous. And so there's this sense that it's really hard to win as a woman, because whatever you do in terms of how you present yourself, you're criticised for it. And I guess where I got to, but it took me a long time to get there, was just try to find a way of being comfortable in my own skin, be my own person, not try to be something I wasn't. And it's the advice I will give to young women who ask me these days, how do you cope with the very gendered, criticism that women get? You've just got to find a way of being comfortable in your own skin. It's not an easy thing to achieve, though.
It takes up a lot of headspace. I mean, just listening to you describing that, you're kind of, I can't fall onto that side and I can't fall onto that side, and I've got to be myself. But I think, as you say, when you're starting out in politics, you don't know who that person is, right?
And I was really young, and if, I don't regret the career path I took at all. I've had an extraordinary career in politics, but if I look back on it, I probably was a bit too young to get sort of thrust so much into the limelight. I hadn't really worked out who I was, and therefore I started to mould myself into something that I probably wasn't in terms of image. But right through my career, and I think women experience this day in and day out, because, and this is a sort of additional aspect of this, there is so much focus on women in the public eye about what we wear and how we look and hair and tone of voice that inevitably it takes up a lot of headspace that guys just don't have to think about. You know, the sort of famous quip of Obama that, you know, he liked to reduce the unnecessary decisions he had to take every day, so he would wear the same colour of suit and tie every day. But you know, as a woman, you just can't.
And Hillary Clinton
do that.
didn't.
And Hillary, you know, had to spend. I mean, I think she once totted up the hours that she spent on a campaign just getting her hair and makeup done. So there's these things that just come with the territory, but they make life a little bit tougher. They change how women are seen and portrayed and assessed and judged. You know, it goes deeper than that. I think we still live in a society where, you know, certain characteristics in men are seen as attributes. If a man is very decisive as a leader, that's good, strong leadership. If a woman is that way, then they're bossy or, you know, aggressive or not a team player. So, you know, is it better now than when I was starting out? In some ways, yes, but I think we've still got a long way to go before any of that really changes.
You were very nervous as being seen as Alex Salmond's girl. I mean, that's your phrase, you know, that he basically picked you out, plucked you out and said, yeah, she's the next big thing. She's going to be my deputy. And you kind of had to go along for the ride. And yet you sort of feel like on every page in the early bit, you're struggling to find your legitimacy, your mandate, right?
So, I mean, the legitimacy and mandate bit came a bit later. You know, when I was First Minister initially, you know, I took over when he resigned, and I did have this, what's the right word to use, obsession about, so it was a year and a half before my first electoral test, I mean, the 2015 general election aside, before the first time I put myself forward as the First Minister, you know, candidate for First Minister. And I really needed, for my own sense of legitimacy, to get that mandate in my own right. Nobody else thought I was, you know, lacked legitimacy as First Minister, but I did. Going way, way back, you know, Alec really sort of started to push me forward when I was, you know, late teens, about 20. You know, I was 20 when he phoned me up and asked me to stand in the general election in 1992. And you know, that was good in lots of ways. He pushed me beyond where my own confidence would have allowed me to go at that time. He saw something in me that I didn't really believe in myself. So that was good. And he did it, you know, he wasn't just being altruistic around me. He knew he had to develop strength and depth in the SNP. So there was a bit of that at play as well. But I guess that sense that he was always pushing me beyond where, I mean, it's for other people to say whether he pushed me beyond where my talents would have taken me, but he certainly pushed me beyond where my own confidence would have taken me. And maybe that developed, you know, a sort of sense that lasted right up until just before our relationship broke down, really, of a sense of, even if I told myself it wasn't the case, of still always kind of needing his approval for things.
It was such a complicated relationship, that one.
Yeah.
And you write, I mean, you've got a whole chapter on Alex Salmond. You say it was harder to write than you'd ever imagined because your friendship was destroyed and then he died. But there are so many instances in the book, Nicola, where he sounds really toxic, to be quite honest. I mean, long before you get onto the sexual misconduct allegations, he sounds quite a bully. He sounds quite manipulative, and I wonder whether you've. I mean, that's how you describe him. Actually,
yeah. I mean, one of the really difficult things about trying to write my relationship with Alec was, well, you know, he was dead by the time the book was published, and by the time it was going to print, and I agonised over, you know, the inclusion or excision of the chapter about him, and I decided to keep it in because, well, till the moment he died, he was accusing me of being part of a conspiracy. I needed to put, I was going to say, my side, the facts of the matter in the book. But because our relationship had broken down, the other really difficult thing about writing about the relationship was it would have been so easy and very tempting to kind of rewrite history and to say he was always this malign influence in my life, and you know, and that's not true. He was, and this is where, yes, it is complex. He, for much of my life, was a positive influence. I achieved more than I might have done if he hadn't bolstered my confidence. Yeah. But yeah, it was complicated. He did have bullying tendencies. He didn't bully me, certainly not in a way that I would describe as overt. But he was in terms of what's the kind of hairdryer treatment that he would give people.
But even you describe at your
treatment.
own wedding that he kind of arrived late, left early, was just a bit miffed that you hadn't asked him to make the speech. There was a sense of like having to be the bride at the wedding, as they say.
Yeah. I mean, there was elements of that, but we, for long periods of my life, we had a good relationship. We achieved amazing things together, and maybe I mean, he's unfortunately no longer here. And maybe I just need, for my own sake, not to have that all kind of tainted, because we did achieve extraordinary things together. And if now I, was to try to say, well, it was, he was terrible at every single stage, I don't actually think that would be fair to him. But it also wouldn't be fair to me, because it would sort of undermine the things that we did together and achieved together. So you're absolutely right to describe it as complex. I sometimes think, even having written about it in the book, I sometimes think I will, for the rest of my life, there'll be a bit of my brain trying to process that relationship. When we fell out, I never feel that is quite the right way to describe it.
Spell it out. You say fell out, but he actually accused you of a conspiracy against him.
Yeah, I mean, that's how people describe it, and it often irritates me because it's almost as like we had a political disagreement or something, and it wasn't that. He
confessed to the behaviour to you of some of the behaviour that he was being accused of. He'd confessed to you.
Well, he would have. He basically gave me a description of one of the things that, in my mind, was an admission of deeply inappropriate behaviour. He would have described it as not an admission, as it was all a misunderstanding. But he was accused of something. He definitely wanted me to help make it go away. I wouldn't do that. And instead of he was acquitted of every criminal charge that he was tried for. So I think it's always important to say that. But in the course of his trial, in the course of what he said to me, there is no doubt in my mind he behaved towards women at times that was deeply inappropriate. And instead of, I guess, reflecting on that, looking at himself in the mirror, trying to be a better man in future, he had to turn it into something in which he was the victim of a conspiracy. So he accused me of orchestrating this conspiracy against him that is so ludicrous. Why would I have done that? How would I have done that? It would have involved, but it is not true. But that's what he accused me of. So when I hear it described as we fell out, it just somehow feels just an inadequate description of what happened. But when it did happen, I went through, I've described it in the book because it is the best description I can think of. It was like a grieving process. I used to have vivid dreams about him and everything would be fine, and I'd wake up, and that kind of way you wake up from a dream and it takes you a few seconds to remember it's not real. And then went through that again when he died, even after everything that had happened, felt, was hit by this wave of loss when he died. So
because your fortunes and your political careers have been so entwined.
Yeah.
I wonder, when you think about the 2014, the independence referendum that you fought together, I mean, does a bit of you wonder whether he set the cause back? I mean, do you think you could have, if you had been leader for that referendum, would you have got independence over the line?
I don't know. There's part of me would love to think that and sit here and say yes, but I think...
Or do you, honestly?
I don't know. I really don't. And I don't think I would sit here and claim that. I think I talk in the book about the times I was frustrated with him during that campaign when he didn't appear to...
He didn't get the detail, he didn't show
apply
up.
himself in the way that I know he was capable of. At other points, he was absolutely brilliant. I still, to this day, I chop and change my mind about whether, if only we'd done a bit better, we could have got it over the line, versus actually, given where we started, maybe where we got it was as far in that moment in time that we could have got it. He definitely, in the course of that campaign, I think, could have done things better, and there's no doubt. Would that have made the decisive
difference? Did you ever tell him that?
We had some conversations. I talk about the process of producing the white paper on independence, when we had a very strained period in our relationship when he just wouldn't engage with it, decided to piss off to, that's not the right way, go on a trade mission to China just before it was due to go to print, hadn't read it, I was having to fax copies of it to China so to try to get him to read it. So yeah, we had some pretty tense exchanges around that time.
I mean, did he ever blame you? Did you ever?
No, he never blamed me for, no, he didn't.
I want to go on to some of the stuff that happened later in the last few years. The question of gender self-ID. And this was a big moment in the Scottish Parliament. It essentially ended up being blocked by Rishi Sunak. And you, again, super frank in this chapter, you say, I failed to engage substantively enough with the concern that making it easier to legally change gender also made it easier for dangerous men to access women-only spaces. Why do you think you failed to engage substantially enough?
So I try to sort of or give a sort of rationale for that in the book, and I think it is rooted in when we embarked on this proposed change. It was back in 2016. Rightly or wrongly, it wasn't controversial at the time. There was total cross-party consensus. I talk about a hustings, a leaders' hustings that happened in 2016, where the leaders of all of the main parties said, "Yep, we're going to do this." It wasn't something Scotland was doing as a groundbreaking, experiment. This legislation was on the statute book already in the Republic of Ireland and many other countries. So I think I didn't see it as the great big controversial thing that it later became, and I think that's probably why I was slow to recognise that there were concerns there, that even if I thought they were unfounded and could be answered, I didn't properly engage sufficiently in order to do that.
Did you just hear bigotry rather than concern?
So I didn't just hear bigotry, but I think there was also, at the point, and I say in the book, I mean, I haven't changed my view on this issue, and I will argue my corner and argue my case on this view, but when I realised it had become as divisive and polarised as it had, I should have paused and seen if we could find a different way of achieving the same outcome. I think at that point, one of the reasons... Why would that have been
different if you essentially
maybe
were still
it
achieving the same outcome?
And maybe that's one of the reasons I didn't know that it would make any difference. When I say achieving the same outcome, what I mean is a world in which, I've fought for women's rights all my life and will continue to do so, a world in which women's rights are not just protected but enhanced, and we fend off some of the real threats to women's rights that are all around us right now, and trans people get to live with respect and dignity in a way that they often haven't, and trans people have always existed. That's what I mean by the same outcome. Could we have come at that differently? And I think in that moment I doubted whether a pause would deliver that. And maybe that's the point, coming back to your question, that I thought there was, and I remember your colleague Lewis interviewing me when I was still First Minister about this, and I said something then that has, I think, been misrepresented because it's taken as me saying everybody who has a different view on me on this is transphobic and racist and misogynist. I wasn't saying that. I don't think most people are. But I do think this whole debate has been kind of hijacked and weaponised by some people who very definitely are. And maybe I just thought there was too much of that in the debate for any attempt to make a difference. So that's my...
I mean, isn't the truth that most people the vast majority of people sit in the middle of kind of trying to muddle through and trying to make sense of something
I think that's true.
With the most humanity they can. Yeah. But there are extremes on both sides.
I think that's the point I was trying to make. And there are extremes on the other side as well.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Absolutely.
But so the thing is, I think it is undeniable that and yes, it is on both sides, but let me just talk about the side I was talking about in the interview that I referenced there. I think it's undeniable that this whole debate has been picked up and co-opted into the wider sort of culture war, battle against wokeism, all of that, and that there are some people who see push back against trans rights as the kind of entry to push back against other rights as well. And I think that is undeniable. And so I'm trying to explain...
Do you think that J.K. Rowling has been co-opted?
I don't have any animus towards J.K. Rowling. I don't think that's the same in reverse, but I am not accusing her of anything. I do think, right, and I don't doubt the sincerity with which she holds her views. If I have an issue with how J.K. Rowling goes about this debate, there does seem at times to be or it seems to me, an attempt to sort of just be gratuitously, cruel to trans people sometimes, and I don't think that's warranted. I think if we all could take a step back from that and try to say what I didn't do a few years ago is look, because you're right, most people want women's rights to be protected and want trans rights to be protected. So instead, the whole climate around this right now is awful for trans people. I mean, it's really difficult for trans people to live in any kind of sense of peace and dignity right now. And I don't believe the majority of people want that to be the case. So can we get back to some kind of, how do we find a way of depolarising this and achieving both these things? Because the one thing I really, really believe really strongly, and I'm not going to just kind of change my mind on this, is that women's rights and trans rights are not irreconcilable. The threat to women...
T-shirt, I mean, let me just ask you about the T-shirt, because this was J.K. Rowling putting a T-shirt on which called you a destroyer of women's rights. I don't know if you saw that. I don't know. How did that make you feel?
That for me is, she disagrees with me vehemently on this issue, and that's her right. I don't have any animus towards her because of that, but it just seemed to me that when you go there, and I was the First Minister, of course I should have got really robust scrutiny and push back to things I was doing, but that just seemed to me a move that was about increasing the temperature and raising the sort of toxicity around the debate and personalising it to a degree that was not likely to help find any common ground. Now, she would say, and I'm not going to try and put words into her mouth, but no doubt she would say, I wasn't trying to find common ground. And maybe there's a bit of truth in that too.
Well, she might say, I mean, I guess the flip side is she thought the temperature was raised.
Yeah.
And that the marginalised, in her mind, would be the women. Let me just put the Irvine Walsh thought to you. He comes at it from a different place, but he says, he basically accused you of forcing the trans issue down people's throats and pushing them into the arms of the likes of Tommy Robinson, Andrew Tate, etc., pushing back the cause of independence. He says something that should have been a fringe issue was allowed to leak into the whole independence debate.
I don't accept that characterisation. It comes
back to this. Did it get too big, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, I think it did, but was that, and I take my share of the responsibility of that, but was that entirely down to me? This was not an issue that I spent all that much time on. When it, as I said earlier on, it wasn't something that I unilaterally decided to do and to push down people's throats. This was something that all parties, in the 2016 Scottish election, all parties had some, all of them used different formulations and different wording, but everyone had a commitment on this in their manifestos. So it wasn't some obsession I had that and that's where it got too big. But it is where it is, and I don't know. Feels to me sometimes as if people will just, they're desperate for me to say I was wrong. I changed my mind. I admit that on this issue, and I will, as I've tried to do, I will analyse and process and try to reflect on the things I could have done differently and better. But I'm not going to. I didn't come into politics to, just to make my own life a little bit easier, just to, dump all over a stigmatised minority. I will always stand up for trans rights. I will always stand up for women's rights. And, while I've got breath in my body, I'll argue that these two things are not in the tension that some people think they are.
So if you were in power now...
Thank goodness I'm not.
I know. Well, I'm sure it's been...
For all sorts of reasons.
But talk me through the Supreme Court ruling. I mean, how would you interpret that? Like, what would be happening in Scotland now?
Well, I mean, the government is reviewing right now how to give effect to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruling is the Supreme Court ruling, and for me, it comes back to something I said earlier. I wouldn't be arguing against what the highest court in the land said. I believe in the rule of law, and the Supreme Court, adjudicates on what the law is, and that's what it's done.
I mean, Isla Bryson, and I know you'll call this a gotcha question, and it's not a gotcha question. It's just a sort of simplification question. Isla Bryson, who is the convicted rapist, you would call a man, not a woman, right?
Yeah, look, the reason apart from just my communication skills deserting me back in the day when that came, Isla Bryson was in a women's prison, I think, for a day, being assessed in the same way trans prisoners had been assessed for years and years and years, and ended up in a male prison. And the reason I hesitate to get pulled down the talk about what and who Isla Bryson is because I know that anything I say on Isla Bryson doesn't stay with Isla Bryson. I don't care about Isla Bryson's feelings one iota. Isla Bryson is a rapist. But I know that anything I say about Isla Bryson immediately gets transferred onto the whole trans community. And comes back to this thing, that might make my life easier. It might make it easier to get through an interview, but I'm not going to be part of this kind of pile on from some quarters on a stigmatised and vulnerable community. So on your question about the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is opined on what the law of the land is. If that means, if the implementation of that does mean, and I don't think it should or has to, but if it ends up meaning that trans people can't live their lives with basic dignity and respect, then the job of politicians in parliaments is to decide how to deal with that and how to make sure the law allows trans people to live with dignity and respect while also protecting the rights of women.
I watched your resignation speech. Was it the 15th of February?
Yeah.
I mean, we were all transfixed because no one saw that.
Except everybody had been predicting it. And then everybody's... In Scotland, I mean, there had been so much, she's going to quit soon, she's going to quit, she's off to do something
and
else.
then you said you weren't. I mean, you made that
exactly,
very clear and you said, no, I'm not going to go. Plenty of gas left in the tank. And you talked about you said you'd been doing this for, non-stop for 25, 30 years. You wanted time to go and have coffees with your niece and nephews, I seem to remember.
I think they had different ideas by the way.
And that's what you said in the speech. You said if they're still around for me. Yeah. You wanted a normal life. What was the thing that just kind of the bolt that suddenly made you go, I want out? I mean, was it the gender debate?
No,
or was it the length of time you've been in? Or was it... I mean, you were asked about the police investigation and the SNP finances, and so everyone it made that connection.
And I totally, given what happened 8 days later, if I'd been watching that, I would have said, well, there's the reason. But it wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. I had I swear that it wasn't. There was a month between me announcing my resignation and actually stepping down. And anybody who was around me in that time says I was happier, more relaxed, looking forward. If I had any inkling of what was coming down the track at me, I would have been unable to function. So,
but you knew the money was missing from the coffers, didn't you, at that point?
I think I need to be careful given the live proceedings of how I characterise this. I knew if anything, I was more irritated at that point than worried about why it was taking so long. But I didn't know what was coming down the track. I absolutely didn't. What was it? So the gender recognition debate wasn't that, other than I felt that was an example of one of the things I was starting to feel, that I had become a polarising figure, and people would come at issues of substance through a prism of whether they liked me or not, rather than look at it on its merits. But fundamentally, it was COVID. And it took me a while to realise this. I was utterly exhausted after COVID, mentally, physically. I'd lost a bit of my appetite for the cut and thrust of politics.
So you were part of the workforce that didn't want to go back to work after COVID?
I went back to work after COVID. I won an election during COVID. But do you know, there was something obviously working away in my subconscious, and then just suddenly it burst into the front of mind. And I did an interview at the start of that year with Laura Kuenssberg, and it was just after Jacinda Ardern had announced her resignation.
Jacinda Ardern. Yeah. Was it a sort of contagion?
it wasn't a contagion, but it maybe was what helped bring it from the subconscious to front of mind, because when Laura asked me the question, because she used the Jacinda phrase, "Have you still got plenty of gas?" and I was like, "Of course I do." But do you know what? I thought about that after that interview, and it just suddenly dawned on me that I remember getting up that morning and reading or seeing on television that Jacinda had said she was resigning, and when I started to think back just a few days later to that, I suddenly realised that my primary emotion at that moment of hearing her make that speech was envy. I thought, I wish that was me. And I think that was the moment that it went from just somewhere deep in my subconscious to, no, actually, this is time for me to go.
So you imagine this lovely bucolic time when you're going to be left alone to have coffees with your niece and nephews, and then 8 days later, the police investigation starts, and before we know it, there is a blue tent erected in your garden that looks like a murder scene. Do you think the police overreacted?
Do you know what? I want to say no, and I'm going to say no because if I ever thought that was the case, then it would raise such fundamental, issues in my head about the operation of justice in my country, and I don't want that to be the case. I'm going to.
The very way you're spelling this out now suggests that you do think they.
I don't know. It was a very, and I'm also we know there are proceedings still live, so I am going to be, and I have to be careful what I say. It was a pretty brutal thing to happen, but I've got to trust that that's what they thought was necessary, and they did that for good reasons.
Do you think the tent was performative? I mean, was there a reason why you need to have a blue tent in the garden?
I think if the police were answering this, I think what they would say was, and this sounds a bit bizarre, but equally I can see why they would say it, that it was about privacy. It was about trying to, do whatever they were doing in the house without people seeing it firsthand. All I can say is it was a pretty brutal thing to go through.
I want to just turn to where we are today. I mean, politics seems to have moved very fast and very far away from where you left it. I want to look at Keir Starmer and his direction of travel, his language. He used this odd phrase, the island of strangers, didn't he? And then he rode back from that and said he deeply regretted it. And this week we've seen a shake-up at the Home Office. Immigration's now in Labour's top 3 priorities. Do you get the strategy? Does it seem...
I get it. I think it's deeply misguided. There are real big issues and problems in the UK right now, and Scotland is part of that, and I was responsible for some of this when I was First Minister, but there's a need to recognise those problems. Nigel Farage is tapping into that sense of pain and suffering and cost of living crisis, state of public services that people are feeling right now. But if you're Keir Starmer and you basically, whatever people think about right levels of immigration or whether it's too high or too low or whatever, immigration is not the root cause of the issues that the UK is grappling with right now. Brexit is more of a root cause of them than immigration is. But if you're Keir Starmer and you're effectively saying, Nigel Farage is right, it's immigration, so I'm just going to try to be better at dealing with it than he is. I just think that is so misguided. If you basically say Nigel Farage is right, then people are likely to vote for Nigel Farage, not you, because they look at you and think, well, you haven't managed to do anything about it so far.
What if Keir Starmer is hearing people say, this matters to me? This asylum hotel matters to me?
People are hearing every day, all over the media. It's not a criticism of the media, that the problem in this country is immigration. So of course people are starting to say the problem in this country is immigration, because they're not hearing. I'm proud to say I think they do hear more of this in Scotland, but they're not hearing politicians say, hold on a wee second, immigration, yes, there are debates to be had about the immigration system and levels of immigration, and I'm not saying we should shut that down, but the reason living standards are falling in the UK, the reason public services are in so much difficulty, the reason communities are suffering the way they are is not down to immigration. Why has ironically irregular, illegal immigration gone up since Brexit, because Brexit took us out of the Dublin Convention. Brexit has done so much, and it's not solely Brexit, but largely that. But people are not hearing the counter argument. They're hearing.
You don't think any politician in Westminster is saying that?
I don't hear it. I mean, I'm not saying none are, but Keir Starmer's not. He's not saying, like, okay, you know, yes, we've got to make sure we've got a functioning immigration and asylum system. Yes, we've got to convince people that the levels of immigration are appropriate. But here's why immigration actually is good for our country. Here's what it's done for the country. Here's why we need it. And here's what the real issues are that we need to grapple with. And here are what the actual solutions are. And he's not doing that. He's legitimising Nigel Farage's central argument. And if you legitimise your opponent's central argument, then don't be surprised if people vote for your opponent.
You boasted that UKIP never really had a firm footing in Scotland, but Reform are now neck and neck with Labour, at least in Scotland. Do you think
they're ahead of Labour at the moment in Scotland?
They? Okay, so what's changing? What has changed there?
I think it's the same as what I've just described across the UK. People are suffering, people are, struggling, people are disillusioned, and they're not. And Reform are doing better in Scotland. The fact that they're doing relatively less well in Scotland than in the rest of the UK,
they're doing massively well compared to
totally
where that party was.
But the fact that they're not in the UK wide, they're in the lead in the polls, or in England they're in the lead in the polls. They're not in the lead in the polls in Scotland because the SNP is still making the kind of arguments about the real issues and how we tackle those issues in a way that Labour is not doing, in my view, in England. But there needs to be, across the board, more of that, of taking on the core arguments that Farage is putting forward. It suits people like Farage to make people think that the struggles they're having, rather than being down to the kind of yawning gap between the richest and the poorest in this country, and Nigel Farage is perhaps part of the minority there. It suits him to make people think it's the immigrant, it's the gay person. If you're a young working class man who's struggling, it's because women's rights have gone too far.
You're saying he's homophobic as well?
I'm not saying he's homophobic. I don't know whether he's homophobic. I'm certainly not going to sit here and defend him. But what I'm saying is it suits him to have people looking in another direction. And it's the playbook of Trump. It's the playbook of these people. So why is Reform doing as well as it is? Because they are tapping into a very real problem. We won't beat Reform by just saying, well, they're bad people and people who vote for them are bad people. The problems that are allowing Farage to make the progress he's making right now are real. But politicians of the progressive left, if I can call it that, have to come up with the solutions that are going to make a difference to people's lives, that actually persuade people, offer them a bit of hope and aspiration and belief that things can get better. And that won't happen, whether it's in America with Trump or here with Farage, by effectively cozying up to them and saying, well, actually, they're kind of right and we'll just try to do their brand of politics a bit better.
We've got Trump's state visit next week. You've written the progressive liberals seem paralysed or worse, craven. The Donald Trumps of this world won't be defeated by flattery and imitation. People must be offered an alternative to the snake oil they peddle. On all of this, I'm unlikely to stay quiet for long. So who are you talking about?
In terms of what? So
yeah, who is paralysed or worse, craven?
I think a lot of I think Starmer, in the way. I get on the international stage with Ukraine, and there's a really delicate balance to strike with Trump. You've got to try and persuade him to do the right thing. But what I've just been talking about here in the UK with Farage and the immigration debate, you won't beat Farage by saying effectively he's right. You have to offer the alternative, not by saying that the problems people are struggling with are not real, but by offering a better set of solutions. And I think unless we get back to a spirited defence of liberal democracy, of progressive politics, of, in my view, solid left of centre politics that make a difference to people's lives, and do that confidently, even if it feels difficult, then the populists, which often seems like too friendly a term for them, are going to continue to make the run-in. And if there was a general election in the UK tomorrow, I think Farage would emerge from it as Prime Minister. And that's, in my view, the really bad news. The really good news is that the general election is not tomorrow. So there's time to try to turn that tide back. But it won't happen unless people actually make the argument and make the case.
He's basically, it looks like he's basically making the case for putting Shabana Mahmood in the Home Office to fight Farage on the issues that Farage is trying to fight the election. Is that going to win for him?
It comes back to what I've said. If it's we're tougher on immigration than you, therefore accepting Farage's central premise that all of the problems that the UK is currently suffering, and there are lots of them, all stem from immigration, then no, it won't win. Because if you're somebody who thinks, because that's what you're being told, that immigration is the problem, you're going to vote for the guy who's always talked about, needing to tackle that, not the Johnny-come-latelys who are now saying, seemingly for electoral reasons, oh no, we'll be serious about it as well. If what it means is somebody's going to say, look, okay, we need to make sure the immigration and asylum system is working. We need to make sure that the levels of immigration are at the right levels for the country. We need to make sure that we're doing more to tackle some of the root causes of migration and asylum, and people desperately getting into these boats to try to find a better life here. But actually, we're also going to stand up for the good that immigration does, for the doctors that work in our NHS, for the nurses that work in our care homes, for the people who are doing essential jobs all over our country, for the greater diversity that has come to cities like this one and different parts of the UK. So we're not going to kind of collude in this notion that immigration is a really bad thing that we've got to stop. Then yeah, maybe if somebody starts making that argument really vigorously, then Farage can be pegged back. But if we're all just going to say, well, he's right, then people are going to vote for him because clearly he's got more credibility on that basis than anybody else is going to have.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.